Hey, everybody, it's Patrick Verno here. I am the host of the podcast Learning from Leaders and also the CEO of Emory Leadership Group. And really, what I wanted to talk about today on this LinkedIn Live was around resistance. And we talk a lot about influence, right? And I don't care whether you're selling a product or an idea or asking people to go in a certain direction the way that you're leading them, is we talk a lot about getting people to say yes, but to me that there's an important component that we often miss, and that's why do people say no, or why do they resist us? And oftentimes that happens first. I had the good fortune almost a decade ago to go through a 3-day certification training with one of the world experts in influence, Dr. Robert Cialdini. He's a faculty member out of Arizona State University. And I went down there and we were in a room. I was with 8 other people. It was unbelievable for 3 days to spend that time with him and talk about influence. And he talks about 6 principles of influence that are all, I think, extremely valuable. And again, it doesn't matter to me whether you're selling a product or an idea or a service, or you're simply trying to persuade somebody to go in a direction that you're asking them to go. But for me, I think what I found important as well in terms of my own experience was that if I was better at understanding of what potentially were going to be the resistors, as I would call them, before I go in and meet with somebody or I'm asking somebody to do something, then my ability to influence ethically, as Dr. Cialdini would talk about, it goes up exponentially. And what I did was I created an acronym called GREAT. And with that, I sort of looked over my experience and experience of other people of saying, what are the real resistors that tend to come up? And I would think we probably all have been in situations where somebody asks us to do something, and our initial response might be to not want to do something or to be protective of our time, our resources. And oftentimes, again, I think it comes into one of these 5 resistors. So in this great model that I talk about, the first one is around goodwill. But before I talk about that, I just want to give you a little bit of an idea on influence from a standpoint. What does it mean to influence? And one of the best definitions that I've come across was in a textbook on influence. And the definition is involving one or more persons who are engaged in the activity of creating, reinforcing, modifying, or extinguishing. And then it talks about beliefs, attitudes, intentions, motivations, and/or behaviors within the constraints of a given communication. And this is in again, a textbook that's titled Persuasion, Social Influence, and Compliance Gaining. And the author on it is Robert Gass. Now, to me, there's a lot there. And I think it can be even simpler than that, is that there really are 4 things that we do when we influence somebody. And it talked about creating, reinforcing, modifying, or extinguishing. And it can even be simpler than that if we think about creating, what we're doing is we're asking somebody to start something, to do something new. So maybe it's a new initiative within an organization. And if we're asking somebody to modify what they're doing, then we're asking the people on our teams to maybe change a little bit. Maybe it's going to the 2.0 version of what we're doing, that we're asking people to modify their behaviors or what they do. We can also be influencing by reinforcing, and we're asking people to stay the course, right? To stick with it, right? To be strong in this situation. Or to give people a comfort to know that we are going in the right direction. That's the reinforcement part. And then the last part is around extinguishing, is that we're asking people to stop doing something. We're going to go in a completely different direction. We're not doing this anymore. And it's asking people to stop doing something. So again, 4 things that we do when we influence. We're asking people to start something new. We're asking people to sort of stick with something, reinforcing it. We're asking people to modify what they're doing, or we're asking people to extinguish what they're doing. Now, again, to do that, I think most effectively, first, it benefits us to understand what are the resistors, what holds us back. So again, I started to mention about goodwill. To me, that is as simple as when we're asking somebody else to do something, they may be thinking to themselves, is what you're asking me to do, is it in your best interest that I do it? Or is it in both of our best interests, right? And really that comes down to, have you taken me into consideration? Or if you're selling me something, is it you don't really care what I need, you just want to sell what you have, and therefore you make money at my expense, right? There's no goodwill there. Now, I came from an industry that I was in for almost 2 decades in the biotech industry, and that was very much on the forefront of this. Is that I think many missed opportunities were because we didn't do enough with goodwill. And certainly, um, the physicians that I would deal with, they were probably thinking, right, is what you're asking me to do, is it in the best interest of my patient or is it in the best interest of your organization? And that's where I think a lot of the challenges came in that industry of not building a good relationship, of really demonstrating that you were there for them and not just for yourself. So the next one is around reactants, and this is about personalities. I do a lot of work in DISC as a personality model, and when we have different personalities, right? How we approach somebody, that in and of itself can turn somebody off. Or maybe I've approached somebody so many times asking them to do something that they've gotten to the point where they don't want to do it just because they're tired of me asking, how am I, how far along are you? How is it going? Right? Have you managed to do that yet? It's no more in a work setting than it is with my kids, right? There's this visceral, I think, experience that happens when people feel as though they're being pushed in a direction that they resist, even if it might be in their best interest to do it. They're just tired of you asking, or how you asked turned them off. So they won't do it. Right. So the next after reactants in this great model is around expertise or experience. And what happens here is the person's questioning, do you even have the ability, the authority to be able to make the request that you're making? Why should I follow you? What experience do you have that would demonstrate that what you're asking me to do is going to be beneficial? And there are some interesting studies on this. I'll bring one in regards to, from an influence standpoint, is around authority as one of the principles of influence that Cialdini talks about. And one of the experiments that was done was they had physical therapists. And what they did was, in two different groups, one of the groups in the physical therapy experiment had all of their diplomas, all their certifications on the wall. The other ones had blank walls. And what they found was that the ones that had their credentials on the wall, that patients seem to be more compliant with those individuals. Now, why? Because they're looking and saying, yeah, you have the credibility, you have I trust enough in your experience or your credentials that you can ask me to do this and I'll follow. Leadership is the same thing. It's developing really a history of trust in individuals, that what you're asking them to do, they can trust that your experience, you have what it takes to get them there. So the next is apathy. One of the things that I think we run into the most, right, especially when we're talking about asking people to start something new or maybe even to modify, is that we don't like change, right? So we're more motivated, we know, to avoid change than we are to gain benefits. And I think oftentimes when we ask people to make a change, we might be talking about all the benefits that they're going to receive by making this change. When in reality, if apathy is what's at play here, what you will see is that it doesn't make sense to go in that direction oftentimes, because here's a person that is completely happy with where they are. They don't want change. So they don't care about the additional bells and whistles because they're saying, I don't need those. I like what I have. When we have apathy, it's oftentimes a better approach to look at what will be lost by not making a change, by not going in this direction, by not implementing this new procedure or purchasing this new piece of equipment, whatever that might be, is that we lose more by not making the change. That oftentimes is what we need to do to get people out of this apathetic environment. The last piece that we'll experience is around trust, right? And that is sort of an umbrella, I would say, to the other four as well. But it's saying, do I trust you? Um, is what you're asking me to do? Part of it is goodwill, but also, can I trust that you're providing accurate information and you're giving me the whole story? Um, when we don't do that, when we can't trust the data, the research that was done, the claims that have been made, right? We're naturally going to resist. All of those things come into play when we're talking about how do we overcome resistance. And oftentimes with my clients, whether it's in leadership or in sales, is I'll challenge them to say, think of your clients, think of those people you're asking maybe to go in a certain direction, and think of it from the standpoint of, great, which of these might be at play that are going to get in my way of getting people to say yes? Have I not demonstrated a sense of goodwill here? How am I approaching them to ask this request? So is there reactance? Have I sort of taken an approach that turns people off? How have I demonstrated my experience or expertise that they can trust that I know what I'm talking about here? Is the group that I'm dealing with, are they apathetic? Do they really like where they are right now and they're comfortable? Because I better know that in terms of how I position this. And lastly, have I built trust within this group? Now, these are all pieces that I talk about in the upcoming book that I have called The Leadership Bridge, which will be launched probably the first week of May of this year, 2022. It's very important if we're talking about trust, especially we talk about behaviors that build up trust within an organization. And that goes into a whole other series of behaviors that we need to constantly demonstrate if we want to build that level of trust. Because when we do that, we'll find that oftentimes people are much more willing to say yes to our requests. So I hope you have found this episode helpful. Again, I think the tool GREAT can go a long way toward helping you understand what resistors you might run into and how you can ethically get more people to say yes to your requests. So as I end this, I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you found benefit in this. I hope it helps you to go out there and rise above your best.